On the morning of October 25th, the residents of the prestigious neighborhood woke not to the singing of birds, but to an unbearable, blinding glare radiating from the top of the hill. The golden domes of the gargantuan mansion reflected the sunlight with such violent intensity that the retinas of onlookers were scorched within seconds. Instead of the welcoming scent of freshly cut grass, the air was filled with a heavy, stifling aroma of raw lime mixed with expensive men's cologne and something reminiscent of the smell of decay. Panicked neighbors drew their thick curtains, but the brilliance pierced through the fabric, turning their cozy bedrooms into operating theaters where everyone felt like a specimen under the microscope of another's vanity. This architectural leviathan loomed over the valley like an embodied sin of pride, suppressing every living thing within a 10-mile radius. Construction had been carried out for 730 days in a state of absolute secrecy, guarded by men in coal-black uniforms whose faces were hidden behind mirrored visors. Every brick, brought from distant eastern quarries, seemed saturated with the energy of oppression, and the roar of heavy machinery resembled the heartbeat of an ancient monster. Residents of the surrounding villas, accustomed to luxury and peace, now felt like mere props in someone's grand and terrifying production, where they were assigned the role of silent victims of visual terror. The dazzling glitter of gold at the top of the hill was so aggressive that birds lost their orientation in space and fell dead onto the impeccably manicured lawns. The neighborhood dogs, usually lazy and quiet, broke into a unified fit of uncontrollable howling that morning, as if sensing the approach of a tectonic shift in reality itself. Those who tried to use binoculars saw only blurred spots of golden fire dancing on walls made of the rarest black marble, the cost of which exceeded the budgets of entire states. Hatred for this structure grew in proportion to its height, turning into a thick, tangible cloud hanging over the district. Inside this shimmering shell, something was happening that defied the logic of an ordinary homeowner, for no one had ever seen deliveries of furniture, food, or art. Instead, caravans of armored trucks entered the mansion's womb every midnight, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and metal shavings on the asphalt. Rumors crawled through the valley like a poisonous fog. Some spoke of the construction of a private apocalypse bunker, others whispered of a portal, but the truth was hidden behind the blinding flash of the domes. The gold on the roof was not a decoration, but a functional element, accumulating solar energy on a scale capable of powering a small metropolis. By noon on October 25th, the air temperature in the immediate vicinity of the estate's fence had risen to 42 degrees Celsius, though city thermometers showed only 20. The leaves on the centuries-old oak surrounding the plot began to curl and blacken as if from an invisible flame emanating from the walls of the most expensive house. Neighbors gathered at the foot of the hill felt a strange vibration coming from beneath the earth, a rhythmic hum that made teeth ache and heads spin. This was not just a building, it was an instrument tuned to the frequency of fear and submission, a vast resonator broadcasting the will of its invisible master. Every decorative element, from the titanium rivets on the gates to the mosaic at the main entrance, screamed of an infinite power that needed neither approval nor understanding from mere mortals. When the solar disk reached its zenith, the brilliance of the dome suddenly changed its spectrum, staining the entire valley blood red and stripping people of their last remains of self-control. Terrified women led children into basements, while men clenched their fists, staring helplessly at the summit where greatness built on a foundation of pure malice shimmered in the haze of scorched air. The silence that followed this surge was far more frightening than any scream, foretelling a catastrophe of biblical proportions. At that moment, a thin beam of pure white light erupted from the central dome, shooting toward the zenith as if piercing the very fabric of the firmament and leaving a perfectly round hole in the clouds. It was the official announcement that the house had come alive, that its internal mechanisms had synchronized and begun their mysterious, destructive work. The smell of construction finally gave way to the aroma of overheated metal and something organic, resembling the smell of burning flesh, which slowly crawled down the slope toward the frightened people. The most expensive house in America was no longer just real estate, it had become an active entity, initiating its first and final dialogue with the world. The owner of the estate never appeared in public, communicating with the world only through the erection of endless walls made of rare black marble that devoured light as greedily as its master devoured the lives of others. For 730 days, thousands of laborers worked in total silence to lay slabs, the cost of each equaling the annual budget of a small city. Those nearby hated this building not only for its architectural aggression but for the way it distorted the space around it, forcing time to slow down in the shadow of its colossal cornices. Birds flew around the hill in a wide arc, and domestic animals in neighboring houses began to howl whenever the wind carried the clang of the automatic gates, resembling a guillotine dropping onto the neck of a doomed order. This marble was delivered from God-forgotten quarries where the stones had for centuries absorbed the cold of underground rivers, and now they surrendered that chill to anyone who dared venture too close to the property line. The builders worked in 3 shifts, yet not one of them ever spoke to the local residents, as if their tongues had been cut out or they were bound by a vow of silence under penalty of death. Each slab was fitted to the next with such precision that the seams were invisible even to the sharpest eye, creating the illusion of a monolithic black crystal grown directly from the depths of the earth. The walls stood 5 times the height of a man and were devoid of windows at ground level, turning the mansion into an impregnable fortress hiding something deeply perverse and monumental behind its facade. Rumors about the owner's identity multiplied, taking on increasingly grotesque forms as the building rose upward, blotting out the setting sun. Some said it was a deposed dictator from a distant eastern country, others whispered of a technological genius who had lost his mind and decided to build himself a tomb while still alive. However, no one could explain why a private individual needed to install a radio frequency suppression system and radars capable of tracking movements in the upper layers of the atmosphere on the roof. Every new detail of the construction only intensified the general atmosphere of paranoia enveloping the area, turning the once elite neighborhood into an exclusion zone where the only law was the will of an individual. The owner communicated with municipal authorities exclusively through an army of lawyers whose faces were as inscrutable and gray as the asphalt on the mansion's driveway. They flooded the courts with lawsuits, bought out neighboring plots at triple the price, and silenced anyone who attempted to initiate an investigation into environmental standards. Money flowed like a river, washing away any obstacles, and this financial omnipotence frightened people more than the black walls themselves, as it demonstrated a complete lack of moral boundaries. It seemed that the building was being constructed not on cement, but on compressed fear and bribed silence, becoming a monument to absolute corruption and limitless egocentrism. Particularly terrifying was the sound that drifted from the construction site during the hours of deep silence, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, when the machinery should have stood idle. It was a low, vibrating hum that caused the water in glasses on bedside tables to ripple and the crystal chandeliers in neighboring houses to chime faintly. Residents complained of chronic insomnia and groundless panic attacks that washed over them simultaneously, as if someone were flipping an invisible switch. The house on the hill seemed to suck the joy and tranquility out of the entire surrounding area, replacing them with thick anxiety and a sense of imminent disaster ripening within those black marble walls. When the 800th day since the laying of the foundation arrived, the workers suddenly vanished, leaving behind an impeccably clean territory and a ringing silence that was worse than any noise. Not a trace of dust or a single forgotten tool remained on the gates, as if the giant building had not been erected by men but had materialized out of the void at someone's command. The gardens planted around the house consisted of plants that never bloomed, their leaves had a metallic sheen and a strange chemical odor that repelled insects. Even the wind seemed to die down as it approached this place, afraid to disturb the peace of the black monolith that was now officially considered the most expensive and most hated house in the entire country. The local sheriff, who attempted to pay an official courtesy visit, spent 3 hours at the gates talking to a speaker embedded in the cold stone but never received an answer. Surveillance cameras, hidden behind dark glass, rotated to follow his every movement, creating an uncomfortable feeling that he was being watched not by a guard, but by some artificial intelligence. The absence of a human factor in managing such a vast estate led to thoughts that there were no living beings inside, only mechanisms executing a set program. This sensation of inanimate majesty gave the neighbors an instinctive urge to flee, to sell their houses for a pittance, and to get as far away as possible from this black hole on the hilltop. Meanwhile, in the basement levels of the mansion, reaching a depth of 40 meters, strange temperature fluctuations began to occur, recorded by the seismographs of a nearby laboratory. The ground beneath the house heated to unnatural temperatures, causing microcracks in the bedrock, yet outside everything remained impeccably cold and still. Architectural aggression was replaced by energetic expansion as the house began to consume electricity in volumes comparable to the operation of a large steel mill. Neighbors saw the lights in their own homes dim and flicker in the evenings, giving up their power to the invisible neighbor who continued to remain silent, hidden behind golden domes and black marble. Every morning, residents found a thin layer of gray dust on their doorsteps that did not look like ordinary road dirt. It had the structure of crushed glass and left tiny cuts on the skin. Analysis of this dust in private laboratories showed the presence of rare elements usually used in the aerospace industry or in the creation of nuclear reactors. Fear turned into a quiet rage as people realized they had become unwitting participants in an experiment whose details no one had bothered to share with them. The most expensive house in America became a cage not only for its owner but for everyone unfortunate enough to live in its shadow, turning their existence into an endless wait for catastrophe. By the end of the second year of the standoff between the residents and the mansion, it became clear that the house possessed its own gravity, attracting misfortunes and ill omens. 3 times, lightning struck the building under an absolutely clear sky, and each time the golden domes absorbed the discharges without the slightest harm to their structure, only becoming slightly brighter. The owner, this ghostly architect of chaos, continued to remain invisible, but his presence was felt in every rustle, in every glint on the black marble. He had not just built a house, he had created an altar to his own arrogance, and soon the time would come for the first sacrifice to consecrate this monument to eternal darkness and insane wealth. The day of the official completion of construction arrived, marked an invitation sent by mail in envelopes of heavy black paper as the beginning of a new era. This event was anticipated with a painful impatience mixed with fear, as every resident of the valley wanted to see the face of the man who had turned their lives into an architectural nightmare. Exactly at 12 o'clock noon, when the sun stalled at its zenith, the massive bronze doors, adorned with bas-reliefs depicting suffering titans, swung open with a visceral screech. However, instead of the expected classical music, the laughter of guests, or a host's welcoming speech, only an icy draft erupted from the depths of the mansion, smelling of ozone and old blood, instantly freezing the flowers in the near. A moment later, from the tall chimney stacks rising above the golden domes like black fingers, a thick, oily black smoke began to pour. It possessed a strange, unnatural density, as if it were a living creature endowed with its own will and weight. The smoke did not rise to the sky, ignoring the laws of physics, but settled in heavy, sticky flakes upon the impeccably white lawns of the neighbors, turning the emerald greenery into a dead wasteland of ash. People stood by their wrought iron fences, paralyzed with horror, watching as the greasy soot slowly coated their expensive cars, the facades of their homes, and their own pale faces, transforming the sunny afternoon into a lifeless twilight. Every breath was a struggle, as the air filled with a bitter, unbearable aftertaste of burnt paper, old leather, and something else that recalled the scent of decay in a sealed crypt. The flakes of soot falling from the sky were so large they resembled charred insect wings, and upon contact with skin, they left dark stains that were impossible to scrub away. Neighbors looked at one another through this black blizzard, failing to recognize familiar faces that now appeared as masks in some diabolical carnival. The silence hanging over the district was broken only by dull thuds emanating from the depths of the most expensive house, as if giant blacksmith hammers were at work deep underground. The omen of the coming collapse was felt physically, like the drop in atmospheric pressure before a devastating storm, stripping away the ability to think clearly. Women pressed their children close, trying to cover their faces with the hems of their dresses, but the black dust penetrated everywhere, clogging pores, eyes, and the lungs themselves. It was like a ritual desecration of all the comfort and prosperity for which these people had worked for decades, building their quiet paradise in the shadow of the hill. The mansion no longer merely dominated them, it was actively devouring their world, processing it into this oily haze that continued to erupt from its womb with increasing force. At one point, the smoke became so thick that visibility was reduced to a few steps, and the neighbors found themselves trapped in their tiny islands of safety, cut off from reality by a black wall. In this gloom, sounds became distorted, a whisper felt like a scream, and the distant hum of cars on the highway turned into the roar of tectonic plates. No one dared to enter the open doors of the mansion, which gaped like the maw of an unknown beast inviting its victims inside. It seemed as if time itself had stopped at the mark of 12 o'clock and 0 minutes, and this endless moment of the beginning of a new era had turned into an eternity saturated with soot and the foreboding of inevitable reckoning. Some of the residents tried to call the police or emergency services, but their phones emitted only a piercing high-frequency beep that threatened to burst their eardrums. The radio airwaves were jammed with static interference, through which fragments of phrases in languages that had not existed on Earth for thousands of years occasionally broke through. The most expensive house in America was broadcasting its power across all frequencies, suppressing the will to resist and instilling a primal terror of what lay behind its flawless facade. The smoke continued to fall, and now it already covered the ground with a layer several inches thick, hiding the roads, the curbs, and common sense. Those who were closest to the gates noticed that the soot had begun to form strange patterns on the surfaces, resembling geometric formulas or maps of constellations that were never visible from the northern hemisphere. This was not accidental pollution but a deliberate message, written with the ash of the past on the canvas of the present. The mansion seemed to be spewing out its internal darkness, ridding itself of the weight of secrets kept in its cellars throughout the 730 days of construction. Every particle of this smoke carried information about crimes, conspiracies, and betrayals that formed the foundation of the capital that built these golden domes. When the initial shock passed, a crowd of people seized by malice and despair began to gather spontaneously at the foot of the hill, armed with whatever they could find. They were no longer afraid of the dazzling brilliance of the gold, as they were now driven by a thirst for revenge for their destroyed peace and desecrated homes. Their faces, smeared with black grease, expressed a determination to go to the end and see who was hiding behind this veil. They moved up the slope, sinking into flakes of soot like an army of ghosts storming a final citadel. The smoke around them began to swirl into funnels, reacting to their movement, but the people did not stop, led by a single impulse of rage. At that moment, a final, most powerful pillar of black steam erupted from the chimneys, momentarily blotting out the sun and plunging the valley into total darkness. In this darkness, the golden domes began to pulsate with a dim violet light, pointing the way to the entrance that still remained open. This was not the finale, it was merely the prelude to what was to be revealed beyond the threshold when the smoke finally cleared and exposed the true essence of the most expensive house. The people approached the very porch, feeling the metal vibrate beneath their feet and the smell of burnt leather becoming unbearably sharp, mixing with the aroma of expensive wine that someone seemed to have just spilled in the depths of the halls. The fate of the neighbors was now inextricably linked with this building, and every step they took toward the doors was a step into a trap snapping shut behind them. The black smoke began to slowly draw back inside, as if the house were taking a deep breath before speaking its first word. A thick fog stood upon the threshold, concealing the interior, and only the glints of flame in the depth of the corridors beckoned the people to enter. They crossed the line, not knowing that at that very moment their names were already being erased from all world registries, turning into that very dust that had so thickly covered their own doorsteps. The new era began exactly as promised, with the total destruction of the old world in fire and soot. A group of the most courageous townspeople decided to cross the property line to demand explanations from the mad architect, whose silence had become unbearable. Armed only with their rage and flashlights, they passed through the wide-open gates, expecting to find within luxurious halls, golden moldings, or at least the traces of a grand celebration befitting the status of the most expensive mansion. However, the reality that met them beyond the threshold proved far more terrifying and devoid of any human warmth. Crossing the boundary of light and shadow, they discovered that behind the facade of rarest black marble, there were no rooms, no cozy parlors, and no staircases leading to bedrooms. The interior space was a colossal void, lacking floors or any furniture. The entire gargantuan volume of the building, which from the outside appeared to be a residential palace, was in fact merely a shell for a hollow concrete well descending to an incredible depth. The walls of this well were lined with gray industrial concrete, etched with endless rows of cables and pulsating tubes through which an unknown dark liquid flowed. The townspeople stood on a narrow technical catwalk suspended over the abyss and felt the heat rising from below, capable of melting lead. There, at the bottom, at a depth of at least 100 meters, enormous industrial furnaces operated in an endless and coordinated motion, their crimson glow barely reaching the upper tiers of this technological underworld. Instead of exquisite carpets, a steel grate vibrated beneath their feet, and instead of chandeliers, massive hydraulic presses and conveyor belts hung from the ceiling. Along these belts, mountains of materials that appeared to be ordinary construction debris from the outside moved in a continuous stream into the mouths of the furnaces, but here they acquired a different meaning. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and tempered metal, and the noise of the operating machinery merged into a single low-frequency hum that made their bones vibrate. This was not a house in the conventional sense of the word, it was a grand machine disguised as a symbol of wealth, an engineering masterpiece created to perform a single function hidden from prying eyes. The members of the group froze, watching as automatic manipulators directed entire stacks of documents, hard drives, and objects resembling personal archives into the fire with surgical precision. Not a single human being was visible amidst this mechanical chaos, only the soulless rhythms of pistons and the hiss of steam broke a silence that seemed eternal here. The black smoke that had so frightened the neighbors outside appeared even denser and more oily here at the very source, erupting from the valves of enormous boilers. The realization that thousands of square meters of precious space were being used solely for the destruction of something vital evoked in the people a sense of deep, primal revulsion. The descent was made via a steep metal ladder that trembled with every step, threatening to hurl the uninvited guests into the glowing bowels of the earth. The deeper they penetrated, the clearer it became that all the architectural luxury was merely a stage set, a screen for this cyclopean incinerator. The golden domes that glittered in the sun served not for decoration, but as giant heat exchangers and antennas transmitting colossal volumes of data into space before the carriers of that data were consumed by fire. This was a place of final settlement, a point of no return where the material evidence of human history was transformed into pure energy and weightless ash. One of the townspeople tried to reach for the edge of the conveyor to grab a scrap of unburnt paper, but a mechanical gripper instantly thwarted the attempt, nearly crushing the man's hand. The machine protected its secrets with cold zeal, not allowing the slightest leak of information from this closed cycle of destruction. The walls of the well echoed the heavy sighs of the furnaces, which seemed to welcome the new witnesses with their greedy roar. At that moment, the people realized they were in the very heart of a giant altar dedicated to oblivion, where the past was being erased from the face of the earth at a speed of thousands of documents per second. The light from the flames below tinted the people's faces in alarming crimson tones, making them look like shadows lost in a labyrinth of technological nightmare. They searched for the owner's office, a control center, or at least a chair where a person managing this process might sit, but they found only endless rows of servers. The entire volume of the building was permeated by a cooling system that hissed like 100 angry snakes, carrying heat away from mechanisms working at the limit of their capabilities. The most expensive house in America turned out to be the most expensive lie, a monument not to life, but to total disappearance, packaged in a shell of gold and black marble. There, below, through the thick glass of observation windows, one could see metals melting that should not melt under ordinary conditions, and priceless items vanishing into the fire. It was a symphony of destruction performed on instruments of titanium and steel, under the baton of an invisible conductor whose will was felt in every movement of the conveyor. The horror of the situation lay in the fact that the house continued to function in its predetermined rhythm, paying no heed to the presence of living beings, as if they were merely incidental debris. The dust that had settled on their clothes outside was only a small fraction of what this industrial monster produced daily. Standing on the lowest tier, directly before the maw of the main furnace, the group of brave souls realized there might be no way back, as the doors they had entered through had long since vanished into the haze above. The temperature here reached 50 degrees, and sweat poured into their eyes, making it difficult to discern the details of the mechanisms that continued their monotonous work. They had become part of the process, witnesses to a great burning that was meant to have no onlookers among mere mortals. The sensation that they were being watched by thousands of hidden sensors became unbearably sharp, turning their quest for truth into a voluntary entry into the traps of a mechanical god. Suddenly, one of the furnaces ceased its roar, and in the ensuing silence, a sound became audible, resembling the ticking of a giant clock hidden somewhere in the very foundation. This sound counted down the seconds to some new stage that promised to be even more destructive for those who dared disturb the peace of this place. The people looked at one another, realizing that in this steel void there was no room for the compassion or logic they were accustomed to in their cozy world. The most expensive house on the planet was preparing to perform its next act, and those standing in its womb were merely the first in line for processing in this endless cycle of purification through fire. The black smoke, which for many days had poisoned the valley air and inspired superstitious dread in the neighbors, finally found its true explanation, one that became a death sentence for the composure of all present. What they had mistaken for an omen of collapse or soot from construction work was the result of a methodical destruction of millions of archival folders, photographs, and documents that armored trucks had ferried into the womb of the hill under the cover of deep night. The most expensive house in America was never designed as a residence. It was the most magnificent, technological, and fabulously costly incinerator in human history. This building had been created solely to turn an inconvenient, dangerous, or too truthful past into irretrievable ash, leaving no trace in the memory of future. Behind the facade of black marble lay an industrial Moloch, devouring the very essence of human identity captured on paper and digital media. Standing on the edge of the metal catwalk, the neighbors looked down into the flaming abyss, and in the light of the crimson flashes, they began to recognize fragments of their own existence in the flying scraps. Into the mouths of the furnaces flew not just papers, but birth certificates, marriage contracts, promissory notes, and medical records of the residents of the entire district, collected with frightening thoroughness. Each sheet, before vanishing into the fire, managed to flare up for a split second, revealing to the world familiar names and seals of state institutions that now meant nothing in the face of this fiery element. The realization of reality came to the people along with the realization of their own helplessness. All their lives, neatly documented and recorded in registries, were now turning into that same sticky soot that had settled so thickly on their expensive clothing. They inhaled the ashes of their own past, feeling the bitter dust of burned memories settle in their lungs, becoming part of their flesh. The owner of the mansion had not just bought their land, he had bought their history to use it as fuel for his giant cleansing bonfire. Every folder swallowed by the flame signified the disappearance of an entire layer of events, connections, and obligations, turning the people around the estate into ghosts without legal or factual confirmation of their existence. The scale of this operation boggled the mind, the cost of the logistics alone to deliver these mountains of compromising material and memory exceeded the annual incomes of major corporations. The golden domes, which had so irritated the neighbors with their glare, worked at full capacity, converting the thermal energy from burning human fates into electricity to cool the servers that rewrote reality in real time. While the paper burned below, above, in invisible digital clouds, algorithms erased mentions of these people from the databases of banks, insurance companies, and social services. It was a process of total personality disintegration, packaged in the aesthetics of extreme luxury and architectural perfection. The people on the catwalk saw massive hydraulic presses crush heavy volumes of court archives, turning legal victories and defeats into a formless mass ready for thermal processing. At one point, one of the conveyor belts jammed, and for a fraction of a second, a family photo album belonging to one of the residents standing on the edge tumbled out of the pile. He saw the faces of his parents, smiling from an old photograph, before a ruthless steel gripper pushed the album to the edge of the glowing well. A moment later, not even smoke remained of his family history, only a barely perceptible change in the color of the flame, which for a second turned bright green due to the chemicals used in printing old photographs. In this silence, broken only by the hum of the furnaces, came the understanding of why the workers had been so carefully hidden and why the lawyers were so aggressive in their lawsuits. The most expensive house was a shield behind which the most grandiose crime against human memory was taking place, sanctioned and paid for by someone who possessed the power to erase the boundaries between being and non-being. The neighbors understood that their hatred of the house had been programmed. It was a smokescreen intended to distract them from the essence of what was happening behind the walls of black marble. Now that they had seen the truth, they themselves had become part of that inconvenient past, subject to immediate and final disposal. Below, in the very center of the fiery vortex, rotated the blades of giant turbines that ground the remains of unburnt materials into a fine dust ejected through the chimneys. That same gray dust that left cuts on their skin and which they found on their doorsteps was the pulverized memory of their ancestors and themselves. It was a sinister alchemy in reverse, where gold and power were used to turn human significance into trash and dirt underfoot. The horror of the situation lay in the fact that the world outside continued to rotate, not noticing how entire pieces were being torn from its fabric, leaving only gaping voids and black holes of oblivion in the place of. The temperature on the technical tier continued to rise, and the people felt their clothes beginning to smoke, as if their very presence here accelerated the process of their disappearance. They looked at the golden ceiling far above, which now seemed to them the lid of a coffin decorated with perverted taste. No one tried to flee, as the gravity of this burning abyss paralyzed the will, forcing each person to watch in fascination as the last trace of their stay on this planet was destroyed. The owner of the house, hidden behind layers of armor and digital filters, had achieved his goal. He had made the past as weightless and useless as the ash flying into the night sky over the valley. As another portion of documents collapsed into the flames, a burst of sparks erupted from the depth of the furnace, momentarily illuminating the walls of the well covered with the names of those who had already been erased from history. The neighbors saw lists stretching into infinity, where their own surnames stood at the very end, marked with red completion markers. This was not just a factory for the destruction of papers, it was the chancery of the end of the world for a single town, operating with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. The most expensive house in America was completing its mission, turning the neighbors' hatred into energy for their own oblivion, and in this act of supreme cynicism lay its true cost. They stood, covered in the soot of their ruined lives, realizing that tomorrow morning their houses would still be standing, but people who would not remember their names would live in them. All evidence of their existence, from the first scribble in a school notebook to the last signature on a will, was now swirling in this scorched air. The silence inside the house became absolute as the conveyor momentarily froze, as if giving them a final second to realize the scale of the catastrophe. In that moment, each of them understood that to be hated is a privilege of the living, and for those turned into smoke and ash, there exists not even such a faint consolation as the resentment of others. Suddenly, the heavy bronze doors far above, behind the backs of the uninvited guests, slammed shut with a crash that drowned out even the roar of the industrial furnaces. The sound of metal striking metal rolled through the concrete well, vibrating in the chests of the people, and in that same second, the automatic security system blocked all exits, turning the mansion into a hermetic sarcophagus. The screech of steel bolts, driven by powerful electric actuators, marked the end of the road for those who had dared to cross the threshold of this technological sanctuary. The lighting on the technical catwalks abruptly shifted from an alarming crimson to the deathly white glare of fluorescent lamps, exposing the true, sterile nature of this place where human life was merely a nuisance in the operation of a perfect mechanism. On the enormous panoramic screens embedded into the interior walls of the well at every level, the image of the house's sole inhabitant appeared, his face remaining hidden in deep shadow. He watched them silently through the lenses of hidden cameras, and this wordless presence felt like an icy touch against the spine of everyone present. The gaze of the invisible master was devoid of malice or triumph, it held only the cold curiosity of a scientist observing the completion of a long and costly experiment. The most expensive house in America finally introduced its owner, but this introduction brought no relief, for behind this image stood the void of a man who had traded his soul for the chance to rewrite the laws of reality. The last thing they realized, standing on the narrow steel ledge above the abyss, was that their years of hatred for this building and its owner had been a carefully engineered part of a grand design. The blinding glare of the golden domes, the stifling smell of lime, and the demonstrative arrogance of the architecture served as a lure, designed to gather the most active, the most curious, and the most dangerous witnesses in one place. The house required not only billions of dollars and tons of rare marble for its completion, it required living carriers of memory whose disappearance would serve as the final point in the purification of its owner's history. Every flash of neighborly rage, every complaint, and every visit to the gates were merely steps toward this final, furnace-lit hall. Suddenly, a soft mechanical click echoed, and the floor beneath their feet, a complex system of pivoting platforms, began to tilt slowly toward the roaring flames. People grabbed for the handrails in despair, but the metal was coated in a slippery layer of synthetic oil, stripping away any hope of salvation. The angle of the incline increased with every beat of their hearts, and the crimson glow from below grew closer, blasting their faces with heat that made their blood boil. In that moment came a bitter understanding. The most expensive house was not just a furnace for documents, it was a perfect instrument for the liquidation of the very possibility of witnesses, turning them into part of the very ash they had. The screens flashed the final frames of their own lives, extracted from remote archives and now ready for final deletion at the press of a key. The master of the estate tilted his head slightly, as if paying a silent tribute to those whose presence had consecrated the finale of his magnificent labor. This was not an act of revenge, it was pure logic of a higher order, where to create a new, flawless biography, it was necessary to completely annihilate the old one along with everyone who could confirm it. The golden domes outside continued to shine, attracting the attention of new onlookers, but inside the well, time for this group of people had already run out, dissolving into the humming flame that left not even bones behind. The floor dropped away completely, and the screams of the people were swallowed by a powerful stream of scorched air rising from the bowels of the earth toward the very sky. The most expensive house in America swallowed its last portion of information, and the furnaces, having fulfilled their task, began to slowly enter conservation mode. A few minutes later, a final cloud of black smoke drifted from the chimneys on the roof, quickly dissipating in the rays of the setting sun without leaving a single speck of soot on the lawns. History had been purged, documents burned, and witnesses converted into pure energy powering the air conditioning of the empty halls. Now, this building truly became a monument to absolute power, the power to decide what was the truth and what had never existed. On the morning of October 26, the residents of the neighboring houses discovered that the massive mansion on the hill looked completely different. Its golden domes had faded to a noble gray, and the black marble walls were covered with a gentle patina of time. Those who had stood in outrage at the gates yesterday did not return home, but strangely, no one raised an alarm, as not a single mention of these people remained in their phone books or in the memories of their relatives. Tax registries, insurance policies, and even photographs in frames on dressers had changed by themselves, excluding the redundant characters from the fabric of reality. The town woke up in a new world where the most expensive house had always stood in this spot, quiet and respected by all, and its owner was considered the greatest philanthropist of modern times. Silence fell behind the mansion doors, interrupted only by the soft hum of fans cooling the empty concrete walls of the well. The furnaces grew cold, the manipulators froze in their niches, and only the screens continued to broadcast an endless news feed in which there was not a word about the incident on the hill. The past no longer existed, it had been recycled, filtered, and cast into the atmosphere as invisible particles that millions of people across the country were now inhaling. The cost of the house had justified itself to the last cent, securing for its master what no other sum can buy, the full, absolute, and eternal oblivion of all his sins in exchange for the lives of those who dared to remember them. The owner of the house finally stepped out of the shadows, but his face was not reflected in the mirrors lining the corridors leading to the exit. He walked past the locked doors behind which life had pulsed only yesterday and felt not a drop of regret, only the satisfaction of a job perfectly done. His footsteps produced no echo in this empty space, as if he himself had already become part of this new, purified reality, devoid of weight and volume. At the threshold, he turned to cast a final glance at the steel maw of the well, and a barely perceptible smile touched his lips before he dissolved into the dazzling light of a new day that no longer belonged to anyone but him. The golden domes began to catch the sun's rays once more, but now their radiance was soft, almost tender, inviting new neighbors to admire the perfection of the architecture. No one drew their curtains anymore, and no one smelled the scent of lime or decay, for the receptors of memory had been erased as effectively as the paper archives. The most expensive house in America stood guard over its secret, ready at any moment to open its doors again if even one person appeared in the world capable of questioning the official version of history. It was the finale of an old legend and the triumphant beginning of a new chapter, written in ash upon the black marble of eternity.